At 12:10 a.m. on June 13, 1942, four men stepped off a rubber raft onto the dark sand near Amagansett, Long Island, and began an operation that depended on a single requirement. They had to vanish before anyone could prove they had ever been there. They came from a German submarine sitting offshore with its engines quiet, and they carried a mission built for a different kind of war. This was not a raid for territory. It was a campaign against functions. Bridges that move freight, rail junctions that move troops, power systems that keep factories alive. Their equipment was issued and packed for that purpose: explosives, incendiaries, timers, primers, and the small pieces that make a device behave like a disaster. The first sequence began with German Navy uniforms, not because uniforms helped sabotage, but because uniforms mattered if the shoreline became a courtroom. A man captured in uniform could argue he was a soldier. A man captured in civilian clothes could be treated as a spy. That legal distinction mattered in 1942, and the Germans planned for it. Then the uniforms became a liability, and the men buried both crates and clothing in the dunes, changed into civilian clothes, and moved inland before dawn turned sand into evidence. A Coast Guardsman encountered them before the beach was cleared, and the contact lasted only minutes. It happened because real operations collide with real life, and real life never follows the rehearsal. The guardsman was suspicious, and the leader tried to end the problem quickly by offering a bribe. The guardsman took the money, walked away, and reported the encounter anyway, because suspicion does not vanish just because cash changes hands. By the time a search patrol returned, the dunes were quiet and the men were already headed for Manhattan, where a stranger could disappear faster than any disguise could protect him. A city swallows faces. A city erases patterns. A city turns a team into background noise. In the Bureau, bulletins about sabotage existed, but bulletins were not evidence. They described industrial targets and transportation bottlenecks because those were the places where a small device could create a large interruption. The bulletins did not provide the things an agent needs to start a manhunt: names, dates, receipts, and a fixed point in the real world. A fixed point arrived through a telephone. At 11:47 p.m. on the night of June 14, 1942, Special Agent Jack Mallory lifted a ringing receiver in the FBI's New York field office and heard a stranger claim that German saboteurs were already inside the United States. Mallory was 42 years old. He had spent 12 years in the Bureau. He had handled bank jobs, extortion jobs, and long fraud cases that ended with confessions and handcuffs. He had never handled an enemy sabotage case operating on American soil. This was his first. The voice sounded sober and trained, with practiced English and a controlled pace. The caller did not demand money, and he did not demand immunity. He asked to speak to the FBI and offered information the way trained men offer it, specific enough to be taken seriously, limited enough to retain leverage. He opened with a number. 8, he said. 8 men meant an operation rather than a lone threat. 8 men meant roles and redundancy. 8 men meant the mission had been designed to survive mistakes and survive losses, because a single arrest could not be allowed to end it. Mallory asked for verification in the only form that mattered. One detail that could be checked quickly without the caller guiding the investigator by the hand. He pressed for a number, a location, or a rendezvous. The caller hesitated the way a man hesitates when he knows that once he gives away a fixed point, he can never pull it back. Then the caller gave a second hard number. He said the operation carried $84,000 in American cash. He said the money was already inside the country. He said explosives and incendiaries were buried in crates near dunes and could be recovered later. He said the teams had a planned rendezvous for July 4th in Cincinnati, and that date was when arrival would turn into execution. Mallory wrote down the numbers, the date, and the city, because they could be verified, and they created a clock with a search radius. The caller gave a name as well: George Dasch. Names were not proof, but names were anchors, and anchors kept an investigation from drifting into rumor. The name also carried risk. A man who gives a name is either confident it cannot harm him or desperate enough to accept the danger. Dasch sounded like desperation. Then he delivered the line that changed the call from a lead into an operational problem. He said the other men would kill him if they believed he was talking. That sentence explained why a man would approach the FBI before any explosion had occurred, and it created a second constraint that did not appear in any bulletin. A sabotage team that remains disciplined can stay hidden long enough to reach targets because discipline prevents witnesses, and witnesses create leads. Once discipline begins to crack, planning becomes less reliable, control becomes harder, and prevention becomes a race against men who no longer trust their own timetable. Mallory did not argue with Dasch, and he did not comfort him. He treated the call as a lead until it became evidence, and he moved to create that evidence before dawn. He did not dispatch uniformed police cars, and he did not light up the city. He sent a small verification team in plain clothes and gave them a single task: confirm something physical that either existed or did not. Before first light, agents dug where Dasch's details pointed, documenting everything because objects and records are what turn a phone call into a case. Crates, uniforms, explosives, and timing devices came out of the sand in the order the plan had promised. That was the moment the case flipped from story to physical fact, and it created the next problem immediately. Evidence does not stop saboteurs who are already inside the country. Evidence proves what they intended. Stopping them requires locating them, controlling them, and doing it fast enough that the plan does not become a crater. Unknown to Mallory when he first took the call, a second four-man team would come ashore in Florida on June 17th, repeating the same method for the same reason: vanish before anyone could prove they existed. The separation of the landings was not an accident, it was part of the design. One landing could be dismissed as rumor. Two landings created the first outline of a campaign. On Friday, June 19th, Dasch made direct contact with federal authorities in Washington, and that contact turned the case from a verified threat into a hunt with a list of names. Under interrogation, he provided identities, contact methods, and structure. The Bureau now had the elements it almost never receives in time: a source, a clock, and a way to move from warning to action. Mallory also had headquarters watching the case in real time, because sabotage on American soil was not an ordinary file. The director wanted results. The Bureau wanted credit. The government wanted certainty. None of those desires changed the basic constraint. Men were already loose in a country designed to absorb strangers. Mallory now had names, a rendezvous date, and a target logic, but none of them were handcuffs, and none of them guaranteed the men would wait to act. A single device placed at the wrong point could force delays that rippled through shipping schedules, factory timetables, and war production, and the nation would not learn where the weakness was until the weakness failed. He kept Dasch under control and pushed him for the habits that produce patterns: where they liked to stay, how they planned to communicate, what they feared, and what they were instructed to do if contact was lost. The information came in chunks, because betrayals come in chunks. A man gives what he must, holds what he can, and bargains with his own survival. By sunrise, Mallory's desk held the outline of a war brought home in paperwork and sand. 2 landings, 8 men, buried crates, explosive devices, $84,000 in cash, and a planned July 4th rendezvous in Cincinnati. The hard part was still ahead. Catching one man would not end the operation if the others disappeared. Waiting too long would allow a single device to turn a bridge, a rail junction, or a power station into a national headline. Moving loudly would spook the entire network. Moving slowly would surrender the initiative to men trained to work without witnesses. Mallory did not have the luxury of choosing a clean fight. He had the fight the enemy brought to him, a case that started on a beach, traveled through a telephone line, and now demanded a manhunt that could not end with most of them. Because sabotage does not require a battlefield. It only requires time, anonymity, and one place the country cannot afford to lose. At 6:03 a.m. on Saturday, June the 20th, 1942, Jack Mallory stood over a table in the FBI's New York field office and looked at what had come out of Long Island sand. Buried crates, German uniforms, explosive components, timing devices, and American cash that had never been near a payroll office. None of it was impressive until it was placed beside a date. July 4th turned equipment into a schedule. A planned rendezvous in Cincinnati turned that schedule into a countdown. 8 names turned a countdown into a manhunt that could not afford delay. Mallory's problem was not finding one man. It was preventing 7 men from becoming 7 separate disasters. A plan built with redundancy could absorb a single arrest. A country built on movement could hide the rest. Every move had to tighten the net without showing the net. Dasch was kept under control and questioned until his story stopped sounding like a confession and started behaving like a map. Mallory stayed away from motives and demanded fixed points: where the men slept, how they contacted each other, which cities they considered safe, and what rules they followed when contact broke. Each claim remained provisional until it could be verified by paper or by an object in a pocket. By mid-morning, the hunt looked less like a chase and more like a counting. Hotel clerks were asked to flag cash payments and abrupt checkouts. Agents copied registers and compared handwriting. Station contacts watched for men traveling light and moving as if they had rehearsed how to look ordinary. Field offices were warned to expect false names and real accents. It was not heroic work, but it reduced a country to searchable rectangles. The first usable break came from a hotel desk in Manhattan. A guest had paid cash, avoided conversation, and asked the kind of questions ordinary travelers do not ask when they are just passing through. Mallory did not send in handcuffs. He sent surveillance first, because arrest is the easy part and control is the hard part. The saboteurs had been trained to notice eyes and angles, so the surveillance had to be invisible. Agents took positions with clean sight lines to the entrance and the stairwell, and an unmarked car sat off the curb with its engine dead. One man in the lobby hid behind a newspaper and watched reflections in the glass more than he watched faces, because a trained target notices staring sooner than he notices geometry. Mallory let the minutes stretch, because certainty required patience. The target emerged near noon and moved with the calm pace of an ordinary traveler. He carried no suitcase, avoided any obvious scans, and behaved like a man determined not to be remembered. 2 agents followed at a distance that kept the man unaware and kept their own nerves under control. The man stopped at a payphone and made a call that lasted less than a minute. That minute raised the stakes. A sabotage team can remain invisible as long as its members remain disconnected. The moment communication resumes, the team becomes harder to predict because a plan can change in a single sentence. Mallory authorized the arrest as the man stepped away from the receiver. The approach was quick and quiet. A hand to an elbow, a badge flashed low, and a few words enough to stop a scene before it started. The cuffs clicked. The search produced what mattered: false identification papers, cash, and notes that matched the outline Dasch had described. The cost appeared immediately. Another man across the street turned his head at the exact moment the cuffs went on. He kept his face blank, avoided any display of panic, and changed direction into the crowd as if he had remembered something urgent. In Manhattan, that was all it took to vanish, and Mallory understood what that meant. Someone outside custody now had a reason to move early. Mallory shifted pressure to transit because transit was the one place where a city could be made smaller. Agents were pushed toward major terminals and the subway nodes that fed them. Hotel watch lists widened from single addresses to corridors. The objective was to deny the saboteurs the comfort of distance, not to catch someone boarding a train. That shift forced a decision about order. Mallory could not treat the remaining men as equal targets because equal treatment produces uneven results when the network is built around roles. He aimed first at the men most likely to move money and messages, because those men could reassemble the operation even if others panicked. He told his teams to look for the practical choke points as well. Anyone tied to contact procedures, anyone who carried multiple sets of papers, and anyone positioned to recover buried equipment before the Bureau could seize it. Every priority came with a price, because speed and discretion do not coexist naturally. Moving too early would scatter the others. Waiting too long would surrender the initiative to men who could announce themselves with one blast. Dasch was used again, not as a hero, but as a tool. Under supervision, he delivered a message that sounded routine enough to keep the other men inside their own procedures. Trained men distrust emotion. Habit is harder to distrust. A meeting was arranged in a location Mallory could control. Agents were placed before the meeting time and given a rule that could not be negotiated. Nobody moved until identity was certain. Two men arrived separately, behaved like men who did not want to be seen waiting, and exchanged a recognition habit Dasch had described. Mallory authorized the move. The arrests were fast and close, the kind that do not give a man room to decide whether he wants to fight. The searches produced more of what mattered to the case than to the newspapers. Additional false papers, travel notes, contact cues, and proof that the men were not drifting but following instructions. The case turned again. It was smaller because more men were in custody. It was also louder because each arrest increased the odds that someone would notice and run. A plan that depends on invisibility starts to collapse the moment invisibility feels uncertain. Mallory expanded coordination beyond New York. Alerts went to other field offices with instructions built around patterns rather than names, cash payments, multiple IDs, abrupt travel, and the quiet manner of men who refuse to be remembered. The German plan assumed America's size would slow American coordination. Mallory's answer was to make the Bureau move like a single organism for as long as the emergency required. Early Sunday, a field office in the Midwest reported a traveler paying cash under a name that did not fit his accent and carrying papers that looked new in a way real lives rarely are. Local agents moved to intercept. The arrest was clean, and the search was better than clean. It produced notes and contact references that matched what Mallory already had, tightening the remaining search area and shrinking the number of plausible hiding places. Another man was taken later that day after a hotel clerk flagged a sudden checkout and a request for directions that sounded like flight. The details differed, but the behavior rhymed. Under pressure, trained men reach for the same cover every time: trains, hotels, cash, and paperwork that claims they are someone else. Those choices do not make them invisible. They make them blend in, and blending in works only until someone decides which pattern to hunt. By Sunday afternoon, Mallory could see the remaining gaps and predict how the last men would try to move through them. Closing the net did not require a long chase. It required removing options until the least safe option became the only one left. One of the last gaps was underground. A man who suspects he is being watched does not always flee to another city. Sometimes he dives into the one system designed to hide movement in plain sight. A subway staircase can swallow a face in seconds. Platforms are crowded, doors open and close on their own schedule, and a target can step into one car while a tail is forced into another. Mallory's teams did not need a dramatic pursuit to lose him. They needed a single closing door. Agents picked up the trail near an entrance and followed into the stations, using columns and crowds the same way the target did. Twice they watched him disappear behind a wall of bodies and waited for the wrong moment to mean the last moment. At street level, near an exit where foot traffic thinned, an agent caught fabric as the man pushed past. The target twisted, tried to pull free, and realized too late that a hand on cloth is not a hold, but it is enough to slow a runner. Two more agents converged. The man went down hard on concrete. The cuffs clicked. The search produced the last set of false papers and the last pocket litter that tied him to the others. By the end of Sunday night, Mallory had the operation contained. Some men were already in custody. Others were located and under active control, with arrest teams positioned to take them without warning the rest. The public record would later show arrests spreading across days and cities. But the decisive work, turning a phone call into a map and a map into handcuffs, happened in that first stretch, before the plan could become an explosion. 8 men had come ashore intending to create damage that would ripple across factories, rail lines, and war production. Mallory's team had prevented a single device from being placed. That sounded like an ending until the next question appeared. How does a country try enemy operators captured inside its borders? The chase had been fought with paper, pressure, and speed. The next fight would be fought with procedure, jurisdiction, and precedent, and the room where it would be decided would not care how close Mallory had come to losing them in a crowd. On July 2nd, 1942, the chase ended, and the case moved to Washington. All 8 saboteurs were under federal control. The buried caches were in evidence. The false papers and travel notes were tagged and logged. The landings were no longer theory. What remained was a decision only Washington could make, whether these men would be handled as ordinary defendants in civilian court or as enemy operatives in a wartime proceeding. Mallory was ordered to Washington with the file and the chain of custody that made the file usable. In a sabotage case, that paper trail is not clerical work. It is the spine. If it cracks, the case collapses no matter how clean the arrests were. The decision came from the top. Washington chose a military commission for speed and control, fully aware the choice would trigger a legitimacy fight. In that room, the case was no longer about movement. It was about jurisdiction. The question was not whether the men had come by submarine or whether they carried explosives. Those facts were already locked in. The question was what those facts meant under American law. The defense moved quickly. Their argument was simple and dangerous. These men were captured inside the United States, where civilian courts were open and civilian judges were available. The Constitution, they argued, did not disappear because the country was at war. The government's reply was built from the same hard details Mallory had spent 48 hours turning into proof. The men had entered as enemy operatives, carried false identities, and intended to destroy domestic infrastructure. They were not being prosecuted for ordinary crime. They were being stopped from carrying out hostile action, and the government insisted it could use a wartime forum to do it. The commission proceeded with the pace the case demanded. Evidence entered as objects and records rather than speeches, recovered explosives, uniforms, cash, false papers, notes, and testimony that tied those items to a plan. The government was building more than a verdict. It was building a record sturdy enough to survive the challenge that was already forming. That challenge reached the Supreme Court through a habeas corpus petition, forcing the central question into the open. Could the United States try enemy saboteurs by military commission when they were captured on American soil? On July 31st, 1942, the Supreme Court issued its decision in what became known as ex parte querin, upholding the government's authority to proceed by military commission in this circumstance. The ruling did not end the argument in the country. It ended the argument inside the case. With the path locked, the commission moved to an ending as quickly as the arrests had moved to a lockup. The government did not want months of procedural delay to become the story. It wanted the record to show intent, method, and affiliation, and it wanted the deterrent effect to be immediate. Convictions followed. Sentences followed. 6 of the men received death sentences. 2 received prison terms rather than execution, Dasch and Berger, reflecting their cooperation with the government and the value of the early warning that helped stop the plan before it became damage. The distinction was strategic. The system was marking the difference between men who carried out a mission and men who helped dismantle it. On August 8, 1942, the 6 condemned saboteurs were executed at the District of Columbia jail, with the electric chair used as the method. The government kept the schedule tight. It wanted the ending to be decisive, and it wanted the lesson to be clear. Dasch and Berger served long prison terms and were later removed from the country, alive but permanently defined by the call that saved them. For Mallory, the final phase carried a different kind of risk than the chase. On the street, danger had a shape, a suspect, a crowd, a door that could close at the wrong time. In Washington, danger was abstract and permanent. A security victory achieved by a process the public would not accept could become a long-term vulnerability, and a flawed record could turn a decisive capture into an open question. Operation Pastorius closed without a single bomb planted, and that outcome created its own legacy. The Bureau came out with a template it would not forget. Demand verifiable details. Turn them into physical proof fast. Coordinate nationally before the enemy adapts, and keep the evidence chain intact from the first shovel to the final ruling. The government came out with a Supreme Court precedent that would be argued for decades whenever national security collided with ordinary procedure. Operation Pastorius did not end with fire on a bridge or smoke over a rail yard. It ended with a legal choice that held up under the highest review the country could apply. The explosives were the visible threat. The greater danger was the time the country would have lost if nobody had known where to start digging.